Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like numbers are still trickling in, but we'll just go through the introductions for a little bit, and then we'll get into the topic. I want to just really thank everyone for attending today. This is a part of my class, Ecology and the Environment, where we have about 100 students. And normally in this class, we would have a climate change lecture at the very end of the semester that would cover a couple lectures. So I've redesigned it a little so we could be part of the Green Street program, which we're very excited to be part of. And so Green Street is part of Wayne State's celebration of sustainability in higher education month. And so what you're going to get today is a very short, brief introduction to climate change, but not in a traditional sense. You're going to have, from me, I decided to approach it from two avenues. I think we get a lot of questions, and a lot of the discussions around climate change often come back to climate has always varied. So what I'd like to do is provide you some information on why it's varied and how it varies and the science behind that, but then touch on a more recent phenomenon we realize is occurring that affects the Arctic and is affecting weather and weather patterns on Earth. And then very excited to also bring to you more of a social component, how climate change affects people disproportionately, and bring in Justin Onwenu to us from the Sierra Club to talk about the more societal impact. So I'll be bringing the science, and he'll be bringing the societal and environmental justice components. So very excited for our presentation for you today on this. So yesterday, as you all might not know, it was Indigenous Peoples Day. And with that, and moving forward, we acknowledge that Wayne State University sits on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, Anishinaabe Nations, Peoria, Maui, and Mississauga Nations. And we would like to move beyond acknowledgements and not only to give respect to these territories that we are on, but commit to learning and growing, starting with partnerships and collaborations moving forward. So we're striving to move forward in a new light, guided by mutual respect, courtesy, and reconciliation. We'd like to welcome Elena Pass' class to this Introduction to Global Stories class. So today we are expecting around 150 attendees to this. So we've decided that we would ask you to mute your microphones and keep your video muted too, so we don't put too many pressures on bandwidth. We have two moderators in the audience right now, students that are going to be monitoring the chat. And so I'm going to ask you to hold your questions from my talk until the very end, because I'm not the feature presentation. But I'll be happy to answer them at the end. And when Justin comes on, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and the moderators will interrupt him and have a discussion throughout that whole presentation, and then questions afterwards. So with that, I would like to get started on presenting to you a little bit of background first on the greenhouse effect. And this is important to present because the greenhouse effect is what keeps our planet warm. And what it is the chemicals. So I don't know if all of you have seen the beautiful Mars in the sky lately. Well, Mars is a great example for this. Mars has no atmosphere, it has no water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxide, ozone, those things in the atmosphere forming a blanket. And what that allows on Earth to have happen is when the sunlight hits the Earth, that blanket of these compounds, primarily water vapor, does not allow the heat, all of the heat, to reflect back. So it creates this warming environment, and it is what allows life to be on Earth. So we know that the physics behind that is clear. We know that that is what keeps us warm and allows us to have warmth. Where the debate comes in is whether carbon dioxide and methane and other anthropogenic or human-made compounds or compounds from fossil fuel burning are disproportionately contributing to that, creating in what used to be called global warming. We now know we shouldn't use the word global warming because that's not an accurate reflection of what's going on. Climate change is many more things, extreme weather events. It's colder in some areas. So we use climate change more often now. So that's the basic science of where the link is between the greenhouse effect and climate change. So we know the temperature has been increasing on Earth since we started recording it. And going back and looking at historical data and other things, we can measure concentrations of CO2 also. So if you look, this graph is showing you the temperature anomalies, and this is when temperatures are different from the average. So until about the 40s, we were having periods where we didn't have differences. And then all of a sudden, we've started seeing increases in these extreme events. And so since we started recording temperatures in around the 1880s, we know temperature has gone up about 1 degree Celsius. But even more disconcerting concerning is that since 1981, that rate has increased to almost 2 degrees Celsius. This may not seem like a lot, but when you start seeing the patterns of things happening on Earth, it starts to be very concerning. Now, we often talk about carbon dioxide concentrations, and this is the tie I want you to be thinking about. This figure is of carbon dioxide. Methane is in here too. I don't want you to worry about that right now. But temperature. And what you'll notice is these compounds and the temperature correlate almost perfectly. So when temperature goes up, CO2 has gone up, or vice versa. CO2 went up first and temperature went up. So over time, we know we can look at this data historically, see these patterns, but also in modern times, measure them and see the correlation between these things. So CO2 is a very good indicator of past climate, as is methane. But you'll also notice in looking at these this graph, this extreme variability. So over the last 400,000 years, we see extreme CO2 and temperature events. So long scale atmospheric concentrations are correlated with those interglacial cycles. To go into that a little further, here's that graph again, going back 400,000 years and looking at those concentrations of CO2. For this, these concentrations were taken out of bubbles in ice cores. So you go up to the Arctic and you drill into the Arctic, you pull out this tube of ice, and then the ice was laid down sequentially, so you can go and pull bubbles, date it, carbon date the ice core, and know that those bubbles were laid down, capturing a snapshot of the atmosphere of 400,000 years ago. And this particular ice core is one of the oldest ones that goes back the longest in history. So we are actually able to measure CO2 concentrations from ice core data. This data we can compare to modern readings, we can compare it to satellite images and get the same concentration. So it's determined to be very accurate through multiple different readings. So on this, we can plot what we know to be our interglacial periods. We can ice scour and a lot of geologic evidence on when we had ice ages. The challenge is, really, since the 1960s, that human footprint, that when humans came around, we started seeing now CO2 concentrations that had never been found on Earth since life was on Earth. Yes, maybe CO2 concentrations were that high in the early formation of the Earth when it was all volcanoes and all that, but not when life was on Earth. So that correlates very closely with these CO2 concentrations. These are taken from Mauna Loa in Hawaii, one of our US observatories. CO2 concentrations represent that human footprint. So right now, we have carbon concentrations around 411 parts per million on Earth, which again, you can see the historic variability and how these concentrations are extremely different than the extremes we've seen throughout history. So yes, carbon dioxide and temperature has varied on Earth for thousands and thousands of years, but not like it does now. So why? So we're going to get a little physics. So we can tie these changes, all of them I just showed you, to what's called the Milankovitch cycles. So an example of one is eccentricity. So eccentricity is that the Earth's orbit around the Earth is an elliptical. However, it's not a consistent elliptical. Over every 100,000 years, we have this cycle where the ellipse expands. So the Earth, part of that cycle, moves further away from the sun. During these periods, it gets colder on the planet. So this cycle, again, is 100,000 years. So that's eccentricity, which is the blue line here, sorry. Okay, so next we have the tilt. The tilt of the Earth is not consistent. it moves. Right now, we currently sit at a tilt of about 23 degrees. So when the Earth is tilted towards the sun in this manner, that northern hemisphere is warmer than the southern hemisphere. Likewise, when it tilts away, the southern hemisphere is going to experience more warmth than the northern hemisphere. We know this tilt is going back every 41,000 years. So when we're looking at those temperature extremes in the graph, we know we have a 100,000 year cycle with the eccentricity, and we know we have a tilt cycle of about 41,000 years. We also have precession. Precession you can think about if you have a top and you spin the top, and the top doesn't spin perfectly. It wobbles back and forth. And this wobble is about every 23,000 years. So as it wobbles, again, it's moving closer or further from the sun. So you've got this ball, this Earth, going along this elliptical, moving further away, tilting, and then wobbling. That wobble is every 23,000 years. So you take these together, in addition to a couple others I'm not going to go into because I only have 15 minutes, and start plotting them out. And so now you can start seeing temperature extremes over time. And there's your eccentricity. Eccentricity was about every 100,000 years. This results in solar forcing, the amount of warmth or temperature coming to Earth. And so when you put all of these together, you get that yellow line, and you plot it out, and you can see the stages of glaciation matching the overlay of all these different physical factors of how the Earth moves around the sun, explaining the variability in the climates that we have seen to date, our natural ones. All right, so that's a bit of the physics explaining the historic variation of the Earth. Now we're going to get to the newer aspect of concerns. Oh, there's your solar forcing. So what's going on? So you've been hearing a lot about there's the classic pictures of the polar bear on the small little glacier as they're running out of ice. Well, what we have going on is the Arctic is warming at a faster rate than anywhere else on Earth. So we have this dark blue line here. Those are our mid-latitudes. So temperate down to the equator, and everything's reversed on the southern hemisphere. But if you look at the Arctic, again, we're looking at temperature anomalies. So these are when you take temperatures that are different than the norms. What we have is our temperature increasing in the Arctic much greater than it is at the mid-latitudes. This really starts very recently. This starts around 1980. And so when you look at that, how unusual is that? So here's an example of the ice sheet reconstructing what it looked like over the past 1,000 or so years. So the red line is the data is showing us, and the pinker area around it is what we think the variation may be. Then we have the modern observations at the end. And you can see, again, this ice extent is dramatically dropping beyond what our history has told us the ice sheet should be doing. 2012 was the year the ice sheet was at its lowest. 2019 was the next lowest year. So we're in a period where right now we are at a reduction in ice again, and that extreme drop. So ice is a mere shadow of what it used to be. So here's a picture, satellite imagery in 1980, of what that ice sheet looked like. You can see it extends to Alaska. It's Alaska, and then we got, that's Alaska, right? And then we got it extending part to Asia and Europe. You move to 2012, where the ice sheet used to be out here, it is now refined to a very small area. It is now, in 2012, half of what it used to be. And in general, in measuring the ice sheet, we measure and report on September of every year to be consistent and not comparing June to June to December or something. So 75% of the volume is completely gone. In 30 years, this is what we left. That is what's left. And in September, that ice is not solid. It is like rotten and slushy. So things can't live on it. So what is going on? We're going to go back to our atmosphere. So here's our atmosphere. This work is taken from Jennifer Francis's work. So we're looking at, again, that layer of atmosphere around the Earth. Naturally, cold air sinks and is compressed. It's denser. Warm air expands and rises. Heating your house, you know this. So around the Earth, our atmosphere creates a kind of this shape where it's shallow at the Arctic and expands at the equator. So what happens is our warm air then is thicker. The layer is thicker here, down here, than it is in the Arctic. So it's creating a hill. So the air flows down this hill as the Earth is spinning. So, right, we've got the air moving because cold air sinks and warm air rises. The Earth spins, and that's what makes our jet stream. We know this. This is a normal fact. So what happens then is if we're changing the hill, the Arctic is warming faster. The hill is flattening. So where this used to be shallow is no longer shallow. And so our jet stream is completely changing. Our jet stream is what determines our weather patterns. And weather is different than climate, right? Climate is that long-term difference, and weather is the event that's happening. But jet stream is what's dictating our weather patterns. So what we see is our westerly winds are weakening, and the wind is essentially wavier. And you can see now plotted along with our sea ice area, indeed, there is a correlation between our wind patterns and our loss of sea ice. So what is this doing? So this is what we refer to as Arctic amplification, the extreme heating event that's occurring in the Arctic and what's happening to the jet stream from it. So we have this poleward temperature gradient that's weakening because we don't have that hill anymore. The upper westerly winds are declining. So that flow is becoming more wavy. So what that does is amplifying patterns that are creating what's called blocking effects, that the jet stream can stall. So because it's weaker, when the Earth is spinning, the jet stream just stays still. So you have these larger waves, the waves of the jet stream, progress eastwardly slower because the westerly wind's not pushing them. And so what happens is you get these weather events that stick around. So you have extreme events like drought. You remember our polar vortexes a few years ago? They just stay and it just won't warm up. And I'm concerned it's going to happen again this year. So AA, Arctic amplification, coincides with changes over mid-latitude land masses. Our coldest in the winter, daily temperatures keep getting colder because that polar vortex sits over us. So the number of days below freezing is increasing in the winter, and the percent of land is extremely cold in the winter months, but then in the summer, we have these heat waves that just don't go away, these floodings, these droughts, and it's caused by these persistent high amplitude jet stream winds. So to wrap up, I told you this is like one of the fastest climate change lectures I ever gave. What evidence do we have? Well, we know 2019 was the second warmest year on record. 2012 was the warmest. We're getting more water vapor in the atmosphere. It's an increase since the 80s. And remember, that can hold more, it not only holds more water, but it's one of the greenhouse gases. 19 of the warmest years on record have occurred since 1850, when we started recording it, since 1998. So when we look at all the years, the warmest years, 19 of them have all happened in the last couple decades. From 1900s to the 80s, a new temperature record was set on average every 13 years. Since 1981, we are now setting temperature records every 3 years. We see decreases in glaciers, both continental mountains, that have contributed to sea level rise. This list can go on and on and on, but I don't have on and on and on to give. So some of the other things is the increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations that we talked about are very likely to have caused some of the most these increases in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my portion of the talk, and I'm going to send it over to Justin. And let me just stop my share for a second. Justin, if you want, you can do your slides while I introduce you. So Justin Onwenu is a fourth generation Detroiter, and he's the environmental justice organizer for Sierra Club. He just, every time I see something of his, he just impresses me so much. He is organized, he fights for clean air, affordable water, the economy for all communities. He has included advocating for city ordinances in Detroit that protect our drinking water, secure funds for communities in need of filtration. So he's actually not just talking, he's actually doing these things. Filtration systems, building diverse coalitions to face the pandemic. He currently serves as the youngest member of the inauguration Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice under the direction of the governor, and is an appointee of the Democratic National Committee's Environment and Climate Crisis Council. He has published opinion pieces for the New York Times, The Hill, The Guardian, the Detroit News on environmental justice and a variety of other social justice topics. And I'm glad he's with us today because he may be on to do huge, bigger things, and it might be harder and harder to get him. So Justin, thank you very much for coming. And I'm so excited about your talk. I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to hear your talk and also to speak to students and folks today just about climate and about environmental justice. As was mentioned, my name is Justin Onwenu. I'm an environmental justice organizer with the Sierra Club. I'll get in later about what the Sierra Club focuses on, but my day-to-day is focused on trying to secure clean air and clean water for all communities, especially in Detroit. And I like to start off my talks by giving just acknowledgements and thank yous. I like to do this at the beginning and not at the end, because a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about, has either been done in collaboration with amazing community partners and residents and professors and lawyers, or it's work that has been going on for many, many years, decades in some cases, and I am simply building on that legacy. So, I want to thank in particular, Rhonda Anderson, who's my boss at the Sierra Club, number of community residents, Teresa Landrum, Dr. Dolores Leonard, and others, and a number of community partners, university and nonprofit partners who just been instrumental in advancing environmental justice in the city and in the state. And again, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. It's kind of hard to see when I'm presenting what's in the chat, but I will try if you have questions that need to be addressed on those particular slides. So just as an overview, I want to talk about environmental justice, which is also known as EJ. And environmental justice is just directly tied to climate change in the talk that we just heard. And I want to give a few examples of what environmental justice is, what it looks like, what it feels like, and how it connects to climate, and why it's important that we fight for environmental justice. And if you can't hear me at any point, again, feel free to unmute yourself or ask in the chat. So just as an introduction, I want to talk about why I'm doing the work that I'm doing now, and fundamentally why I care about this work. So for me, I was born in Detroit. My parents divorced, so I actually split time between Birmingham, Alabama, and Detroit, Michigan. And, during my time down south, I remember, I was young at the time, but I remember Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the aftermath in 2006. And Hurricane Katrina, if you all have, if you were around during that time period, or if you remember the images, or if you've studied that time period, this image on the left you see is something that is that sticks in my mind from when I was watching TV with my mom, from when I've studied it years later. But it's an image of folks who are stranded in New Orleans because of Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina is held up as just sort of a textbook for what environmental racism and environmental injustice looks like. You had certain folks in the city of New Orleans who were safe from catastrophic flooding. Other communities were not. Asking questions like which communities were more at risk, and asking questions like why were African Americans who were seeking supplies and refuge packaged or viewed as looters when other folks in other parts of town, in other communities, were simply searching for help. So these are some of the discussions that were prompted by Katrina, just massive disparity. And the picture on the left is something that, that sticks in my mind. So for me, I grew up and still in college was interested in medicine, like a lot of college folks. I came in pre-med, but I also stuck with pre-med. I stuck with all of the requirements that you have to take. I was interested in doing emergency medicine. I was interested in setting up clinics around the world and around the country. And so, you know, for me, my mom being a nurse, grandmother being a nurse, medicine is just, and healthcare is just always something that I was thinking about. The picture in the middle at the top is a picture of, I think, a Halloween costume I had when I was a kid. And you can't see the writing is a little bit too small, but it says Dr. Justin or Dr. J.N. Onwenu, MD. So this was a lifelong dream for me, was to heal people, to focus on public health. And for me, that changed my final year of college. And so the picture on the right is a picture of kind of the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, which was a storm that hit Houston, Texas in 2017 when I was a senior in college. It caused, you know, by some estimates, it was the most costly storm in US history, $125 billion in damages, a number of lives lost, thousands of pounds of pollution that were released that weren't supposed to be released. And so this was a turning point for me. The picture in the middle at the bottom is a picture of a home that I actually saw when I was, you know, my first year of college. There's a group that takes folks on toxic tours, which is where they take you in areas that are burdened by pollution to show you just how close industry is to homes. And the home that you see in this picture is the home of a Houston police officer who's been living there for many, many years. Family's been there for many, many years. That is literally feet away from a toxic tank farm, which holds toxic materials, byproducts of the refining process and other toxic process, industrial process. So this image is something that stuck in my mind all throughout college. I'm interested in medicine, but I also want to figure out a way to address root causes. And so for me, saying that someone's house is right next to a toxic processing and holding facility is something that I thought about as something that could drive health disparities. And so when the hurricane hit in 2017, I still had in mind, what if you live right next to one of these tank farms and there's a huge flood? And that's actually what happened for a lot of folks. There were dozens of industrial facilities that stopped monitoring the pollution that they put out into the environment. There were some tank farms or toxic waste holding facilities that were not properly protected. They didn't invest in the right infrastructure. And so a lot of this waste ended up finding its way in the floodwater that went into people's homes, that went into schools, that went into religious centers. And so this is something that we're still dealing with today, trying to track the sorts of environmental and toxic exposures that people were exposed to. So again, interested in medicine, that changed after the hurricane because I started thinking about climate a lot more. Storms are becoming a lot more intense. They're happening in California and in the Gulf. They're happening more frequently. Even in Michigan, we're seeing weird weather patterns. The dam that collapsed in Midland or in central Michigan this summer is an example of just extreme rain matched with infrastructure that's not built to handle these events, causing catastrophe. And so for me, this was a turning point. I started thinking about climate. I started thinking about environmental justice, the proximity that certain communities are placed near refineries and other industrial facilities. And I started thinking about the relationship between that and all these events that we're seeing more frequently now. And so after college, I worked for the Children's Environmental Health Initiative. It used to be located at U of M, but moved down to Texas. And the initiative that I was in charge of doing outreach for was the Hurricane Harvey Registry. So my job was basically to go to community center to churches, to to other public health fair events, and basically ask people, what was your life like before the storm and what was it like after the storm? And the reason that we were doing that is we wanted to try to uncover the health disparities, the housing disparities, the economic disparities that popped up before or after the storm, I should say. One of the reasons we did that was because the city of Houston wanted to portray an image that, that the city is safe for investment. $125 billion in damages, the city of Houston on the news for weeks and weeks and weeks. The city government wanted to portray an image that the city was safe, that if you invested and put your headquarters here, that you wouldn't be dealing with flooding every year, and that simply is just not true. But our job was to try to quantify that impact. So that's background on me. It's background on what I'm doing now. I'm working for the Sierra Club, and I'll get into that a little bit later. These are just some of the images that that stick in my mind from after the storm. One of the things that I discovered in doing volunteer work and sending out volunteers, we ended up sending out about 1,700 volunteers, students and professors and staff, to go out into Houston and to help people recover. So one of the things that people had to do was remove drywall from people's homes. If you let drywall sit in your home, that drywall you'll have mold in your home, and that mold can have a significant impact on people's health. And so this is just an image that sticks out in my mind. And these are just some of the types of impact that we were trying to track. And so I was based in Houston, but traveling, an hour, 2 hours outside of Houston, again, asking people, did you have headaches and migraines before the storm? What's it like now? Shortness of breath. A lot of folks had their asthma aggravated or breathing conditions that they never had before the storm because of the pollution that they were exposed to. Things like income loss and vehicle damage can have ramifications for years after a storm leaves. If you can't get to your job, then you can't afford, basic necessities because, you can't get to your job. And how does that cascade and continue to cascade years after the storm leaves? So these are the sorts of effects that every natural disaster tied to climate, these are the sorts of effects that we're going and that we're already starting to see. And so we have to think about this. When we think about climate change, we have to think about it, in my mind, not just as saving our climate, but saving ourselves, saving our health, saving our communities from the sorts of effects that we saw after Hurricane Harvey. That year in 2017, you may recall that there was a hurricane that hit Puerto Rico, that hit South Florida. There were, of course, wildfires on the West Coast in California. There was just weird weather events in the Midwest, extreme weather that impacted agriculture, that impacted communities that were hit with tornadoes and weird hail events. And so this is just one year, and we had billions of dollars in damages that our federal infrastructure and state infrastructure just was not prepared to deal with. So again, these are the effects of climate change that we're dealing with now. This is what got me into this work. And also it's important to think about the types of vulnerabilities that I touched on before. If you live right next to a refinery and you're flooding every other year, or if you already had issues with housing that wasn't adequate, but you have a tornado or hurricane hit, the folks who are already vulnerable are going to be pushed to be even more vulnerable because of these climate-linked storms and disasters that we're facing. And for me, I experienced 3 500-year storms in 5 years. I stayed in Houston for 5 years, and there are 3 500-year flooding events. And so this is just something to think about as we think about environmental justice, as we think about climate. So now the Sierra Club is where I work today, and I'm focused on access to clean air, clean water. The Sierra Club is one of the oldest and largest grassroots environmental groups. It has a lot of chapters in every state. And there are a lot of different campaigns and programs within the Sierra Club. One group focuses on shutting down coal plants. Another group focuses on gender equity. Another group focuses on environmental justice and health impact. And so the Healthy Communities program, which advocates for environmental justice, is the program that I'm in. So what is environmental justice? That term has been used a lot. So just want to start off with definitions. Environmental justice is essentially the fair treatment of all people, regardless of background, when it comes to implementing, developing, and enforcing environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And that's important because development, implementation, and enforcement, they all have to be met for justice to be achieved. You can have great laws on the book that aren't implemented or that aren't enforced correctly, which is what we see at the federal level now, where we have, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, but they're not being enforced properly. There isn't proper funding for the EPA. There isn't proper funding for the Department of Justice to go after bad actors that put our air and water at risk. And so implementing, developing, and enforcing is just really important to keep in mind. Another definition that I really like from someone who is just a cornerstone of the environmental justice movement is the quote that he uses is that whether it's by conscious design or institutional neglect, communities of color, and this is folks in, rural poverty pockets, Native American reservations, African American communities, Hispanic communities, these communities face some of the worst environmental devastation in the nation. And I like this quotation because it says, whether it's by conscious design or institutional neglect, environmental injustice or any form of injustice is not just about laws that are written on the book to be racist or to be harmful to certain subsets and certain populations. It's about how institutions neglect communities as well. Which communities don't get the funding that they need? Which communities, when you're determining whether to build a bridge in a community, which is something that is relevant for Detroit and the Delray community, which community can you build a toxic waste facility in or a bridge in where the residents don't have enough political capital or enough money to fight back? So it's about design, it's about zoning laws and public health laws and environmental laws, but it's also about neglect. So these are the definitions that I'm working on. So environmental injustice today, what does it look like? And again, I'm coming to this from a public health, my interest in medicine and public health, but the reason why I think environmental justice is so important is because it's connected to so many other issues that I'm sure you all care about, that you all are studying or that you all are working on. It's connected to education issues. There's a large body of research that links education disparities, racial disparities, and economic disparities to the environments that students are learning in. So childhood asthma and poor air quality is highly linked to school absenteeism and to school performance. It's connected to healthcare, which is a big issue politically. It's tied to folks having to pay higher costs for prescription drugs, to pay for asthma medication and cancer treatment and other conditions because of where they live or where they work. That's environmentally not safe, I should say. It's tied to quality of life. So sirens going off, the psychological impact of not being sure if a refinery is going to release something in the middle of the night that can make you sick. And it's tied to, what I find interesting as well is it's tied to home value. So home-based equity is how wealth has been built in this country traditionally, that's the word. And the value of your home is directly tied to what sort of environment that home is built in. So if you bought a home in the 40s or 50s, or your parents did or grandparents did, and pass it down, what's the difference in a home that was bought in Detroit next to an oil refinery that has expanded and expanded over decades? What is the value of that home if it was moved to Grosse Pointe or to even another part of Detroit? The value of your home would be completely different based on the sort of toxic facilities that are located around you. And that has tremendous implications when it comes to economic justice. So I want to give a few examples, local examples of the sort, kind of case studies of environmental injustice. And I hope this is helpful for you all to imagine and to think about how these issues are connected to climate, how these issues are connected to other issues that I just brought up, economic issues, education issues. And again, if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. I found a way to keep the chat open. So if you have any questions as I'm going over these examples, please don't feel free to point out. So just as background, one example is Marathon. It's located in a community that by some researchers has been called the most polluted in the state of Michigan. Southwest Detroit, 48217 is the zip code. And this is, the only refinery in the state of Michigan. It's connected to Line 5, which is the oil pipeline that you may have heard about that carries some of the dirtiest fuel oil in the world from Alberta, Canada. Tar sands oil carries it down through the Straits of Mackinac, which is an extremely sensitive part of the Great Lakes. I see in the chat, one of the questions is, does this plant mine salt? So interestingly enough, if you come down I-75 south, you can see towards downriver, you can see, basically what looks like another city, which is the refinery. And you'll also see like basically a mountain of salt mine. And that is because there is another company, the Detroit Salt Mine Company, that mines for salt. And they share some property. So it looks like the refinery is doing it, but they're not. So this is a refinery that produces hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per week. And again, is located in an area that's already burdened by pollution. I want to just give a couple of examples of, and these are things, I try to talk about just things that I have worked on specifically. There's a lot more to talk about when it comes to this facility. But the defining events for this facility over the past 3 years, you may recall many, many years ago, basically mountains of black dust being stored along the riverfront. And that dust was petroleum coke, which is a byproduct of the refining process. And that dust, which turned out to be petroleum coke, which is carcinogenic, it's not good for your health, was being stored on the riverfront without covering. And the material was coming from Marathon. And so there was an ordinance passed in 2017 that finally required companies to cover this toxic dust on the riverfront and throughout the city, which is something that is one of the few environmental justice laws that have been passed on the city level. Last year, there was also a polar vortex. We heard earlier about the frequency of polar vortex events happening. And that event was responsible or was cited as a factor for a release event at this facility where toxic fumes made the air smelly and made people sick. And this is again, this is a facility that also had issues late last year where workers were hospitalized for a release event as well. And so one of the things that I want to bring up when it comes to this facility is just to think about the psychological, not just the health impact of having toxic fumes, in your neighborhood, but also the psychological impact of not knowing if this could happen tomorrow. Or if you hear a siren because the refinery is doing some drill or is having some issue, does that mean that the facility is gonna have a fire? Does it mean that there's gonna be a release event? I mean, roads have been closed, emergencies have been declared because of the facility, and there are still folks who are living feet away from the facility. I think that's something to keep in mind. One of the questions in the chat is about zoning laws. Could zoning laws help solve this issue? And one of the things that I find interesting is Houston, where I went to school, didn't have zoning laws. And in a lot of ways, you could have the running joke is you could have, what's the proper term? Not child appropriate facilities located next to schools or next to churches. And And that was true. Houston doesn't have any zoning laws. And for that reason, you could have a refinery next to a residential neighborhood. Detroit has zoning laws. There are industrial use zones, there are residential use zones, there are commercial use zones. But still, one of the issues is that there aren't strong guidelines about how far, how large a buffer should be between a residential and an industrial use facility. So I met a guy who lives next to a concrete crushing facility that literally, I went in his home, literally shakes his home on a daily basis. We've all been inside during the pandemic, and I just think about how could you stay inside in a home that is shaking every day because a facility 5 feet away from you is constantly with a jackhammer crushing concrete. So Detroit does have zoning laws, but the zoning laws in my mind aren't strict enough to make sure that there's an adequate buffer between people who are living in a neighborhood and facilities like this one. And also the pollution travels. So what is the right distance for there to be a buffer? Is it a mile? Is it 2? These are questions to keep in mind. AK Steel is another facility located locally. It's located in Dearborn, also borders Detroit, and it's near not just a mile or 2 miles away from a school, but you can see how close this school is, or there are actually 2 schools that are located right next to the steel mill. And this is a steel mill that has been called by regulators, and we know this based on private emails that were sent at the state level many years ago. This is a facility that has a record that, that has called them the most egregious facility in the state because of their pollution violations. Located, a football field away from a school. And the only thing that separates these schools from this facility is a small road and a train track depot where you can kind of see the trains in the left-hand corner above the car. But those are the only things that separate those schools from the steel mill that's had an awful relationship with pollution. So I do want to give an example of kind of the battle with this company. Again, this is a company that's had not a great record when it comes to environmental protection. But they've actually had a recurring pattern, which I find interesting, which is that they will continue to violate permits. They will emit more lead and manganese, which are chemicals that aren't good for you, into the air. And then when they have bypassed the limits set by the state, they will just ask the state to raise the limits. So it's like, the speed limit is 50, you go 70 every day. And then you get pulled over and ask the police officer, can you raise the limit to 90 so I don't get in trouble as much? That is essentially what this company has done and did in 2013. There are a lot of groups that are still suing them over this decision that dates back to 2013. But it's something that they also have tried to do in 2020, earlier this year. They sought to triple the levels of lead and manganese, which is a chemical that has a huge impact on neurological development in kids. Luckily, there were a lot of community groups that were vigilant, that made a lot of noise to the state of Michigan and also to the company to say this is just not acceptable. So they did withdraw their requests to raise the limits of pollution that they put out into the environment, but this is still a facility that's a problem, just given how poorly they've done in investing in pollution control technology that we know works and that we know lowers pollution. But that pollution control technology costs money, and this is a constant battle that we're engaged in. You all have heard of Flint, of course, in the Flint water crisis. There are also just environmental justice issues around water that aren't connected to Flint. So water shutoffs is a huge issue that groups like We the People of Detroit and the People's Water Board have been focused on. Because the federal government has disinvested in water infrastructure for so many years, the cost of delivering water has increased, and it's left folks who are economically vulnerable, unable to pay for water, and they've had their water shut off as a result. So this is another example of environmental injustice that people are battling with. And I bring this up because it's directly tied to climate. Water privatization, there actually was an article, I think, that came out in Bloomberg maybe, that basically said water is becoming the new oil from a commodities trading perspective. And that's because water is extremely valuable. Aqueducts, which are a huge source for fresh water, are being dried out. There's record drought all throughout the world in many pockets and many areas. And so water is becoming a commodity. It's becoming a resource to be traded. It's becoming, even in the state of Michigan that has access to 20% of the world's surface level fresh water, that we still have communities in Detroit, whether it be water shutoffs or Flint and lead exposure, that don't have access to clean water. And this is directly, again, tied to climate. Gloria says Marathon and AK Steel are two of several polluting entities in 4217. We need to pay attention to the cumulative impact of their activity. And Gloria is an amazing advocate, so thank you for that comment. And I want to give one more example of something that we're engaged in right now when it comes to environmental justice around U.S. ecology. So this is a facility that, again, this is work that's been going on for a very long time. But residents in Hamtramck and in Detroit have been battling against U.S. Ecology, which is a hazardous waste processing company that's actually headquartered in Idaho. So this isn't even a Michigan company. But what they do is they process and store hundreds of thousands of gallons of toxic waste. And this is a facility that was granted by the state the opportunity to expand their operation tenfold. So they're processing now, hundreds of thousands of gallons of toxic waste, things like arsenic, things like PFAS, cyanide, and other harmful chemicals. And the stat that I want to just leave you all with this facility is that people of color, communities of color, make up 25% of the state's population, but 65% of those living next to hazardous waste facilities. And what I think is important when it comes to environmental injustice is that this doesn't just happen because Black and brown people want to live next to hazardous waste facilities. We have to look at root causes that go back to redlining and housing discrimination, that go back to zoning regulations and rules that are decided by political actors that can decide whether one neighborhood gets this facility located in their backyard or whether another neighborhood does. These decisions are systemic, and the result is schools located near facilities that process the most dangerous and harmful chemicals in the world. Well, Gloria mentioned in the chat is something that I do want to spend a second to talk about, which is the cumulative impact of all of these facilities. So I gave a couple of examples, and again, these are just surface level. We have limited time. These are just surface level examples of environmental injustice. Marathon, AK Steel, US Steel is another facility in the area. DTE has a coal plant that's located in River Rouge, also in the area. There is a salt mining company, which at one point was mining under people's homes that you could feel shake the dynamite from the explosions underneath the ground from salt mining. So this map shows you that, again, we're not just dealing with one company at a time, but we have to consider the cumulative impact of all of these companies located in your backyard. And so one of the issues with our laws right now is the fact that we measure and we allow companies to pollute on an individual basis. So we look at company one and we say, you only want to pollute 100 million pounds of pollution per year. Great job. You are under the limit. Company two, you want to pollute 99 million pounds of pollution. Great job. You're under the limit. Company three, you want to pollute 80 million pounds of pollution per year. Great job. You're under the limit. But what we don't consider is the fact that company 1, 2, and 3 all are located in the same area. So, and there are a couple of ways of looking at this. there are chemicals like ozone, SO2, sulfur, and other chemicals that we tightly regulate on an individual basis. But what we don't consider, if company 1 and 2 are located right next to each other, and there's a community located in between these companies or in the middle of this area, that community experiences all of these companies at once, not just one at a time. And so our state and our federal government, I think, have a huge job to do to start measuring the cumulative impact of pollution, so that the communities that are located in areas where there's concentration of industry are kept safe. And again, when you look at where these facilities are located, whether it's in Detroit, whether it's in Michigan, whether it's in Texas or in other places, there's a place down south in Louisiana called Cancer Alley, where you can literally track the incidence of cancer tied to refineries that are concentrated in these communities. All of these examples of environmental injustice have some root causes: redlining, housing discrimination, racism. So this is something that we really need to consider, and it's something that I hope you all take in mind. Also consider, you live in a community that's had where water is shut off, and then you have to deal with pollution, and then you have to consider, where were freeways built? Which communities had freeways built in a way that disrupted the neighborhood and the community cohesiveness? So these are all just things that we can't look at on an individual basis. We have to start thinking about them cumulatively. I'm looking in the chat. Great. So I'll move on. So how have people organized against this injustice? So these are just pictures from kind of planning and organizing meetings that we've had. Picture on the right, I think we went out to dinner or to lunch at some point to strategize. But I think, the environmental justice community in Detroit is really close-knit. This has been a battle that's been waged for decades. And there are a lot of tactics that people have used over the years. To give kind of an example of how people have organized, and again, I try to speak about things that I've been engaged in, but there are a lot of examples and a lot of great campaigns, like if you all want to look up different campaigns, the Breathe Free Detroit campaign, was shut down the incinerator, is an example of how people have organized against environmental injustice. But the example that I want to give, and the model that I want to talk about, is a model of agitating. So this is a model that Regina Strong, who is the environmental justice advocate for the state, likes to use. But it's agitating, which means raising the profile of an issue so that it becomes something that people can't ignore. So agitating, speaking truth to power, forcing those who have power to do differently and to actually advocate for community. So it's agitating, advocating, and negotiating. The second step, advocating, is about coming to the table with very specific policy demands so that we can move the needle. And negotiating is saying, okay, we've agitated, we've made it so that you have to answer us. We've advocated, we have a list of policy demands that are very specific that can move the needle. And then we have to negotiate. Sometimes there is area for common ground, for people to come together and say, you want this, I want this, let's meet in the middle. Sometimes organizing around environmental injustice is not about what's the best policy or who can discover the best research to back up the best policy demands. Sometimes it is about, this company has a very different interest than the community and then advocates. And it's a question of power. Who has more power, who has more influence, who has more resources to advocate and to move their desires and their demands forward. So sometimes this is a matter of being organized and being disciplined and being diligent. And sometimes it's merely a question of who has enough power to implement what they want. So one example I want to give is the Detroit River incident, I should say. And this is relevant because, more news just came out recently. But you all may recall late last year, there was a piece of contaminated land contaminated with uranium, PCBs, and other chemicals that collapsed into the Detroit River. So this was over the Thanksgiving holiday, I believe. And we found out because the Canadian newspaper, the Windsor Star, reported on it about a week after it happened. So this is a site that was once used for the Manhattan Project, which is our effort to build, the country's effort to build an atomic bomb. And so there were a lot of concerns about, was the water contaminated? There are a number of drinking water intake facilities along the river. So was our water contaminated? How did this happen? What did the company do wrong? What could they have done to prevent this? So all these questions came up. And so what did we do? So we immediately that day, and I say we because I was coordinating, but with a lot of different partners. So that day when we found out, there were a lot of rapid response calls that we had with legislators, with lawyers, with public health experts, basically asking ourselves, what do we know? What do we not know? How do you as a public official not know, but we know? Or how does this newspaper know before the public knows? So these are sort of the questions that we're asking in the immediate aftermath of the incident. A week after the incident, again, or a week after we found out that this contaminated land collapsed into the river, we held a big town hall. And this was a chance for community members to come and, again, speak truth to power, having public officials up there with no filter to have the community ask questions and demand more from our government at a local level, state level, and federal level. And this was the result. So we had hundreds of folks who showed up, members of Congress and community residents. There wasn't a pedestal that public officials were put on. We had the Coast Guard there, the governor's office, the mayor's office, 2 members of Congress. And we basically said, what are you all going to do differently so that this doesn't happen again? We, of course, don't want the river to be contaminated. Rising water levels tied to climate change makes this an even more urgent issue. And we also want to make sure that our drinking water is safe, that our Great Lakes are protected. So what are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? So actually, you can see in the picture, the guy in the sweater, kind of brownish burgundy sweater, is holding a piece of paper that has a list of about 20 demands that we came up with. So one of the things that we did is we talked to, university professors, lawyers, to basically come up with a list that was vetted, well-researched, investigated, to say what can the state do differently, what can the city do differently, and what can the federal government do differently so this doesn't happen again. And we came prepared with those demands. With all of these people, created pressure for government to act. So now where we are in this process, there was an ordinance that we wrote, that we worked with a member of the Detroit City Council, Councilwoman Castaneda Lopez, to introduce. The Detroit River Protection Ordinance is the name of the ordinance that is aiming to, prevent, these sorts of incidents from happening again, to protect the Great Lakes and drinking water. And so this is what's happening on a local level. On the state level, the state just issued a $60,000 fine against the company that was operating at the facility illegally, I might add, without a permit. And so this is just an example of how folks are engaged in fights around environmental justice. This work is very crisis driven. So a release incident happens, or a hurricane happens, or contaminated land collapsing into the river happens. And communities have to find ways to respond in a way that protects people, that informs people, and then ultimately in a way that builds towards policy solutions in the long term. And I think the crisis aspect of this is really important because it's directly tied to climate change. If you have 3 500-year storms in 5 years, and each storm is making people sicker and more vulnerable because of the environments that they're living in, because of the lack of investment in infrastructure, we have to start thinking differently about climate change, about how we respond to crisis. And one of the questions asked in the chat is, how do I make sure that environmental justice and climate change are linked? especially making sure that people think about the big picture with local emergencies taking up attention as well. And I'll take, yeah, I'll take time to talk about climate change and from a messaging standpoint, how I try to incorporate in the work. I think for me, climate justice, climate change, activism, environmental justice are just, I think about them in one and the same. And the reason why I do that is because the communities that will be most impacted, that will be made most vulnerable because of climate change are the same communities where, refineries locate and steel mills locate. These are the same communities. And for me, I think that, and I'll talk about this later, I think we have to change the way we talk about climate change in a way that reaches people on an everyday basis. If you are in Jefferson Chalmers and you are flooding because you live next to the river in Detroit, that's directly tied to the sorts of ordinances that we're trying to pass because of this environmental justice incident along the river as well. So I think we have to find a way to link resilience, and that could be around heat waves that are becoming more common because of climate change. We have to link resilience and vulnerability, which we see in environmental justice communities, with climate. We also have to link the types of emergencies that we see because of climate change to, racial disparities and economic disparities that exist. So I don't view these as separate issues, and always try to emphasize health disparities, public health impact, and I try to link climate change and environmental issues to things that people are thinking about every day. So childhood education, home values, healthcare. These are things people think about every day, and climate is going to impact and drive all of these areas. So that's how I try to weave these things. How I do want to make sure I'm okay on time. What time is it? It's hard to see on my laptop when I'm in present mode. How much time do I have? 12:38. Okay, great. Well, I will wrap up. So challenges and opportunities. So I've talked about this throughout the chat, but I think fundamentally when it comes to environmental injustice, one of the issues is that communities are constantly having to prove that they have been harmed. They have to basically get PhDs in epidemiology and public health and all of these basically degrees that community residents have to get while they're working other jobs to prove that a toxic waste facility located feet away from their home is harmful. And I think fundamentally we have to shift that conversation. I think the way that we do that is by talking about the cost of environmental injustice, the cost of climate change. When you hear folks talk about climate action, whether it's the Green New Deal or cap and trade or other climate related policies, people always talk about the cost of implementing these policies. And I think what we have to start talking about, if you're an advocate, if you're interested in getting involved in these issues, is talk about the cost of doing nothing for our climate, and also the cost, the healthcare costs when you live next to a refinery, the education cost when you live in a community that's polluted. We have to start finding a way to talk about the cost of climate change and environmental injustice that we just don't see. Those externalities are really important to point out. Cumulative impact is something that I mentioned before, making sure that we're doing things like a cumulative impact analysis, climate impact analysis, and environmental permitting procedures. The last thing I'll just say is when states hold companies accountable, oftentimes the fine money goes to the general fund of the state, but not to the community, and that's something I think that needs to change. So I have 3 more slides left, so and they're quick. It's basically how should we think about environmental injustice and the climate crisis? How should we talk about it, and how should we fight for environmental and climate justice? And the first thing I want to say for thinking about these issues is the importance of thinking intersectionally, and I know that's a word that is hot right now, but I think it's just really important to think about how climate links up to so many other issues. I think that is the only way to build coalitions with other folks who don't think about climate, who don't think about environmental issues as important. We have to find ways to link up folks who are fighting for, you know, investments in schools or healthcare. We have to find ways of linking up those issues to climate issues. I think there are a lot of intersections. False choices, there's oftentimes debate around jobs and environment that I think we should just not get engaged in those false choices. So we have to be building coalitions with folks who want jobs. There's a huge opportunity to build green jobs, solar jobs, wind related energy jobs that I think we have to talk a lot about as well. How should we talk about environmental justice and climate? I think focusing on mass action personally is something that we need to do more than personal decisions. Often, what I will say is that oftentimes people's personal decisions about conservation or veganism or other things are oftentimes gateways for people to get engaged in the larger fight and larger movement building. And that's something that I definitely recommend. But I think overall, to get people engaged, we need folks engaged in, you know, the handful of companies that are driving climate change, and not people's very, very personal decisions that have a minimal impact on climate compared to the companies that I think are driving the crisis. And because of time, I will move on to the next one, which is this: how should we fight? So again, mass action, building solidarity. So I think we have to find ways of building coalitions between environmental justice communities in Detroit and Flint and Harbor and other cities and other parts of the country, with communities that may not be impacted by refinery pollution as much as others, but who are interested in tackling environmental justice and climate change. So finding areas of solidarity, I think is really important. There's a set of principles that I would recommend just looking up if you're interested, called the HEMES principles. You could also look up the environmental justice principles, which basically talks about, if you're interested in activism and getting involved in these issues, how should you approach working with communities on these issues? So I think those are just guidelines for how should we fight climate change and for environmental justice. And with that, there are a couple of, if you're interested and you're just really, you know, excited about this topic, there are a couple of resources and books I would recommend if you want to just take a quick screenshot of this. And with that, I am just so glad I got to talk to you all. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll drop it in the chat as well. But thanks again for having me. And I don't know, I answered questions as I went along, so I don't know how much time we have for questions. But thanks a lot for having me.
I thank you, Justin. I think I'm comfortable, everything went super smooth. Opening your mics if you want to ask questions, feel free to go ahead and do that, and we can stay on for questions for 5 or so minutes.
Great, and one of the questions in the chat is around how can we help each other reconnect with Earth, with our home, because people are so disconnected from nature. And I think that's really important. You know, the Sierra Club does have a model of taking people out on outings, so kayaking and trails and camping as a way to get people involved. And I think that's a great model. But I do think that, you know, there are a lot of indigenous leaders who have spoken for a long time about how people are just disconnected from nature, and that's a root cause for the way that we're treating the Earth. So I think that's a good point by Gloria. Well, thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put in the chat as well. So.
Hello, Justin, I have a question.
Hey.
Hey, earlier when you were talking about how the pollution waste of companies are individually monitored, if the state or national government, one of those, were to create a baseline pollution waste management system, how do you think, or do you think that would be an effective way to monitor pollution waste, because companies make different amounts of different compounds based off what they produce?
Great. So can you explain that a little bit more? Baseline pollution.
So like So you know how you're talking about different companies, like the government says they have individual standards of pollution waste, like they makes like, for example, 900 million pounds versus another company that can make 500 million pounds.
Right.
Well, if those two companies make different products, which in turn would make different waste amounts, if the national or state government were to create a baseline, like all companies have to reach this certain amount of waste, do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, I kind of mentioned this earlier about negotiating and about how some things aren't a question of whether it's a good policy decision, but about who has the power to implement whatever they want. And I will say at the federal level, the federal government would not do that, or this current administration would not do that. You know, because it would require businesses to do more or to be a little bit more proactive about lowering pollution. I do know that the current, trying to stay nonpartisan, but the current Democratic nominee is interested in that type of approach and has talked a lot about cumulative impact from air pollution. So I'm hoping that with a different administration on a federal level, at least, people that will be able to see those sorts of changes. But I do think that that's probably the biggest priority for a lot of environmental justice advocates, because it's been ignored for such a long time. So thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? And again, feel free to email me at any time if you have any questions or want to chat.
And Justin, I have gotten a few questions to share the recording, which I plan to do. And also, I usually share the slides with my class. Is that something we can do if you send them to me?
Yep, I can send them to you.
Okay. Oh, someone's suggested a group chat. Nice. And I can share, for those listening, Justin has sent me a bunch of links that I have provided to my class that cover a lot of topics that he discussed. If you reach out to me, if you're at Wayne State, just Google my name, Donna Kashian, it'll come up. And if you're with Green Street, please reach out. Just Google my name and it'll come up. I'll put it in the chat too, just in case that's helpful.
Great. Thanks everyone for your kind words.
Thank you for your time, Justin, very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
All right. My email's in there if anyone wants it, to request it outside of the classes. Well, thank you. We had quite a few people on board, and there are additional Green Street activities coming up, so please look and see. I have a slide for that. Let me see. I'll do a screen share with some links to that really quick. Let me put that on. Sorry, my mouse is acting funny to blow it up. I have two screens. I never know which screen my mouse is on. So there we go. So if you want to look at some of the other Green Street events coming up, please stay tuned. And we have a Slack channel for discussions that some people like mentioned, group discussions. That would be great to be involved with the conversation, not only with the discussion today, but also at the other events. And just to mention the PFAS, and there's an event coming up that will have a panel on that. So please check out the sustainability.wayne.edu engagement Green Street and join in some of the additional events. All right, well, thank you. And Justin, I guess I'll wrap this up. And once again, thank you and have the rest of the day nice. It's beautiful out.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.